You're listening to Hanging, an original podcast series from the Mercury News in San Jose, California. The old barn with the gable roof hasn't changed much in nearly 3 decades. Sheriff's Deputy K.W. Klaver and his family used to live in the ranch house up front. It's only a half-hour's drive from Silicon Valley, but it seems like a million miles away. KW's 10-year-old son Josh used to raise his rabbits in the barn and play in the hayloft. He'd pretend to be Indiana Jones with the boy next door. KW butchered livestock in a slaughter room here. He would hang the carcasses from a bright orange meat rail attached to the rafters. The Klavers had been gone for years when a county coroner and a sheriff's detective showed up on a pleasant summer morning in 2014. They walked down the gravel driveway and into the musty old barn. They carried a 25-year-old autopsy report, a camera, and a tape measure. But the coroner didn't have everything she needed, so she asked the new owners if she could borrow 2 things, a kitchen chair and a rope. She had come to reenact a hanging.
That always kind of bothered me, the case, to tell you the truth. It always bothered me, because I'm a 10-year-old.
Child custody, the situation, the emotion. I would have jumped on that in immediate. There's too many red flags here. And I really feel sorry for that little boy.
What could be going through his mind? What can make him do this? The more I think about it, it don't make sense.
10-year-olds are not even going, they're not going through puberty. They're, the kid was scared. I don't believe he killed himself.
Looking back, do you have any regret that maybe you should have done a more thorough investigation?
Yeah. But I still don't think KW had anything to do with it.
Do you think he killed Josh?
I don't know.
Welcome to the Mercury News podcast series Hanging, the mysterious case of the boy in the barn. I'm Julia Prodis Sulek.
Chapter 1.
In 6 chapters, we're going to explore a brutally difficult question. How does a 10-year-old boy end up hanging on the family farm? Was it suicide or something sinister? It happened almost 3 decades ago in a little town on the southern edge of the San Francisco Bay Area. On January 30th, 1989, Joshua Sean Klaver was found in the barn, hanging from the meat rail where his father would hang steers for butchering and pigs for scalding. A thick rope, the type used to lead horses, was around the boy's neck. At the time, the sheriff and the coroner quickly concluded his death was a suicide. They blamed a bitter custody battle between Josh's unmarried parents. But for nearly 30 years, a stream of questions, revelations, and lingering doubts has pulled authorities back to the case, again and again. And in 2014, an intriguing development popped up, one that led the Santa Clara County Sheriff to quietly reopen the case, and the county's medical examiner, Dr. Michelle Jordan, on her extraordinary mission to the barn.
I'm looking at a case 25 years later. I just thought it was really important and very thorough to go back to the scene and look at the scene for myself and determine whether Joshua could have been capable.
A sheriff's detective with her was investigating another possibility. Could Joshua's father, a deputy with a documented history of abusing the boy, have done it instead? Journalists get calls all the time from people who feel wronged, people with a story to tell, people like Josh's mother, Kathy Atkins. Often they don't pan out, but there was something so chilling about the story she told me. Josh was only 10. I have a son of my own. I can't even imagine. And the sheriff's office had launched a new inquiry a quarter century later, investigating, one of its own. Josh's father, K.W. Klaver, had moved his family to Oklahoma after he retired on disability. I had been reporting on problems at the county jail, and Kathy had read some of my stories when she reached out to me. "Please take a moment and learn about my son Joshua," she wrote from her home in Philadelphia. "It needs to be shared with the public." She was a mother racked by guilt, and over time I'd find out why.
For 2 years after he died, I lived with the drapes pulled, that someone knock on my door or the phone would ring, and it would panic. I can't stop thinking about Josh. It's the first thing I think about when I wake up in the morning. I don't know how many times I sat on the floor in the bathroom and just sobbed, talking to God, making him explain.
Kathy told me KW had been home alone with Josh that night until his wife at the time, Bobby, returned. When the couple went out looking for Josh, they found him hanging in the barn. Kathy said she always felt KW had something to do with it. The deputies who investigated that night, she said, were KW's friends, and she insisted they ignored all sorts of red flags. KW had a history of abusing Josh, she said, but no one would listen to her.
We were told that it was a tragedy, his death. They would not investigate Joshua's death because they had real crimes to solve. That's what they told us.
This was an incredibly delicate story to look into. In some respects, it was the most sensitive and morbid kind of mission. This mother was asking me, find out whether a man she had never married and had battled years for custody, a man who had never been charged with a crime, was responsible for the death of their son.
Just because they had a prior history doesn't mean that necessarily somebody killed somebody. How are you going to prove that without, so he had child abuse conviction, even a conviction, which he didn't. But if he was accused of child a year before, 6 months, 3 months before, why does that say that he killed his son?
Okay, that was Sergeant Jerry Eggy. He was quoted in the San Jose Mercury News 28 years ago explaining that Josh had killed himself because of the bitter custody fight. As he put it back then, the boy was caught in between. He loved his father, but he wanted to live with his mother. Custody battles can be brutal. We all know stories of parents making up awful things or exaggerating just to hurt the other parent. I had to wonder, all these years later, was this mother taking that awful dynamic to the extreme? But now the investigation had reopened. In 25 years, something had changed. Someone besides Kathy had doubts. And if investigators were interested, well, so was I. I hopped in my car and headed down Highway 101 to San Martin to look for answers. I had to find out, who are these people? And most importantly, who was Josh? San Martin is a little town of 7,000 and looks like the perfect place to raise kids. It's a world away from the stresses of the traffic and high-tech campuses that sprawl north of here. San Martin shares a border with Gilroy, and on a summer day it smells like garlic in the mornings and strawberries in the afternoons. Tom Rocca's family has owned the market here since 1927.
It's still very rural, still a lot of farms. It's changed a bit in terms of the dynamic, but it's still a small town. There's not a McDonald's on every corner. There's not a stoplight every 10 feet. It's still very simple.
I followed a hay truck off the freeway to San Martin Boulevard and passed signs on telephone poles advertising fast rural internet and free manure. Then I turned on Columbet Avenue to the old Klaver place. The one-story ranch house and the barn sit on a flat acre behind a low stucco wall. KW always kept the gate shut across the driveway. The new owners keep it wide open. I had just started my reporting, and regretfully, I didn't think to record my interview with a neighbor, Ray Toll. He was working on his car in the driveway next door. Yes, he knew the Klavers. Yes, he remembers the chaos of that night. And he remembers KW screaming, Why did this happen? Toll said that KW never mentioned Josh after that. Not over the fence, not during breakfast at Betsy's Cafe in Morgan Hill. Not a single word about him. Josh was a good kid, he told me. But if I wanted to know more about the boy, Toll suggested I talk to his son Buck. The two were best buddies. Buck was surprised to hear Josh's name when I called him. He was only 9 when Josh was 10. Whenever Josh stayed at his dad's house, the two boys were inseparable. As Buck described it, they would play every day until the light went away. They'd build forts with scrap wood, ride their dirt bikes, and throw mud clods in the barn. Sometimes they'd steal bell peppers from the farm across the street and cook them in Buck's Boy Scout camping tins down by Little Yagas Creek. "We were always up to something," he said. He never saw a dark side to Josh, but Buck knew that sometimes Josh would be upset and anxious about having to go to his mom's house in Hollister, a town in the next county over. And he said both of them were scared of KW. It wasn't a normal respect your dad thing, he said. It was a cowboy cop kind of thing. Everything was always, don't piss off KW. Buck also remembers that his father wouldn't let him go to Josh's funeral and told his son only the barest of information. They found Josh hanging in the barn. They weren't sure why he did it. Buck said had he been older, he would have asked more questions. "I never understood why a 10-year-old would have had that many problems that he would commit suicide," he told me. 10-year-olds still have baby teeth. They're still in grade school. I looked it up, and in the years since Josh died, there's only been an average of 9 suicides each year among 10-year-olds. That's across the whole country. Just 9 a year, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. It's not unheard of, but it's rare, and so young. Could Josh have been one of those rare cases? Could he have been so torn, so distraught over his parents' tug of war, that he wrapped a noose around his neck and jumped? Before the age of Google, could he have even known how? When Buck looked back to those childhood days with Josh, something else struck him. Josh would often stay at the Tolls until well past bedtime, when they heard the calls from across the fence from KW's wife, Bobby. "I think he felt safe at our house," Buck said. "It just felt like he never wanted to go home." Can you tell us about how you met KW and what your first impressions of him were?
I met at a bar, a country western bar, a group of friends. We'd go. A couple of the girlfriends were dating. Some of his friends.
The relationship between Kathy and KW was admittedly brief. They met at either Sam's near the Capitol Drive-In or the Saddle Rack across town. They don't agree which. It was the late 1970s, the era of the rhinestone cowboy and Kenny Rogers. Kathy didn't really fit in. She was a self-described hippie who followed the Grateful Dead and hung cotton tapestries on her bedroom walls. Women thought KW looked like Tom Selleck right down to the bushy mustache that he twisted as he talked. He stood 6'2" from his hat to his boots and kept a can of chew in his back pocket. KW stands for Kyle Wayne. They call him K-Dub for short. He lived in a trailer on his parents' place in nearby Morgan Hill while he was starting his custom butcher business.
He was a hunk. He was a good-looking guy with a bad mustache and a hunk.
That's David Sussman, a lawyer who represented KW in his custody battle.
He was built, and he was good-looking. He had that male confidence, that male physicality, and because he was a tough guy. He butchered animals. He did his own fence post. He was a hard-ass farmer, and he was a cop. He knew how to use guns. He had skills, and he was, There's a certain segment of the female population that they find that really attractive.
Kathy fell for KW the way all the women would. As she put it, he was just sprinkled with cowboy dust, I guess.
He was, tall, handsome, and, cowboy.
What was your impression of him in those early years? What kind of person did you think he was early on?
Never thought he was harsh. Just, someone that knew what he wanted, strong personality. There's never any rudeness or, and then we didn't see him for a bit after Josh was born, just every once in a while.
There was never any talk of marriage. Kathy was 7 months along before she told him she was pregnant. They were barely in their 20s, and neither were ready to be parents. Kathy was having troubles. With Josh in tow, she moved from her parents' house to friends and back to her parents. She started abusing drugs. At the same time, KW started seeing Judy Werner, a woman 11 years older than he was. She drove a white Corvette and owned the Nails R Us salon in Gilroy. She was also raising 3 boys of her own.
I met KW through friends at a little rodeo type event type thing locally down in San Martin. A lot of us used to party on the weekends at a place in I don't know if it's Morgan Hill or something. It was called the Silver Saddle. It's now a church. But that's, and then he would show up there and we'd dance with him. I just met him through friends.
I wasn't the first person with questions to navigate the steep driveway to Judy's property. A pair of sheriff's investigators had been there months before to ask about Josh's death. The 2 of us sat on her patio in San Jose's East Foothills overlooking Silicon Valley. She fiddled with a cigarette as we talked. Judy's memories of those early years with KW are good ones. What attracted you to him?
He's gorgeous. I could show you a picture. He's a good-looking man. Good-looking man. Very, very, very tall, big guy. Tall, good-looking. And we got along. We went out, and we started seeing each other more and more and more. And he was at the time when I first met him, he was into bodybuilding. So I used to go to the gym and work out with them, and we did that for couple of years, bodybuilding.
What kind of work did he do before he became a sheriff?
He was a butcher. Not the one who cuts meat. K-Dub would go to your ranch, slaughter the steer there, right there. I have pictures. They go out and they kill the steer, and then they hang it up. He's got the portable truck there, and they skin it there and gut it and whatever, and then they take it and they drop the meat off at the butcher shop. And that's what he did.
At the couple's wedding, Josh carried the rings on a little white pillow and wore powder blue tux, white corsage, and cowboy boots, just like his dad. It was 1981, and Josh wasn't quite 3 at the time. That's in one of the photos Judy keeps in a box in the rafters of her barn. There's one of Josh on the back of a horse, and another of him standing proudly with his dad, the 2 of them in plaid shirts.
He was fun. He was happy child. Happy, happy, happy.
Judy had encouraged KW to take a more active role in Josh's life, especially when Kathy was having trouble.
She had some bad times, and I convinced her to let us take care of Josh for a while until she got on her feet, which she did. And it was, Josh stayed with us, basically, and we, communicated. She came and got Josh, and we did things together. Her and I, we took Josh places together, and we became good friends. At the beginning, she was a little standoffish, but I explained to her, I'm not here to take your son away from you. I'm here to help you, and Josh used to tell everybody he had 2 mommies.
Back then, Kathy was grateful for the help. What could be better for a boy than life on a farm, raising rabbits and riding horses, right? Looking back, Judy said, she fears she did the wrong thing. By then, KW had entered the Sheriff's Academy and set his sights on a law enforcement career.
He became a deputy sheriff. He changed his demeanor, his attitude, his personality. Everything about him changed. He rarely took that badge off. He always carried a gun on him. And he says, this is what we're supposed, I used to question him for so many, this is what we're supposed to do. I says, I don't know. I have a lot of friends and they don't do this.
Like what? What do you mean?
Well, I mean, go to the laundromat. He's got his gun in the back, like kind of back here, and he would have his badge over here on his belt, where people could see it.
And Judy told me life got difficult for the entire household, especially Josh.
It was always me coming to his rescue. I mean, just like, what are you doing? And I would jump up and kind of push him away. And what are you doing? He would sit. He literally a couple of times force fed him to where he gagged. If a kid doesn't want something, they don't want something, period. And I know we were at the dinner table where he slapped him off the chair a couple of times, and my boys were there.
She would later testify about the abuse in court. When I called Judy's middle son, Gilbert Sandoval, he told me the same thing. It was a very scary thing to watch, he said.
KW would, I have seen him literally get pissed off that Josh was not eating or wouldn't eat what he thought he should eat, and take food with his fingers and shove it down, and this is not an exaggeration, shove it down his throat where, Josh was choking and couldn't breathe. The bottom line was, you're going to eat whether you like it or not.
Gilbert said he has no doubt deep in his mind that KW loved Josh. Who doesn't love their child, he said. But KW's personality was stronger, he said. In his eyes, his son had to grow up to be a tough hombre. There was something else Gilbert says always struck him, a comment that I would look back on months later as my reporting unfolded. He couldn't ever remember KW hugging Josh or telling him he loved him.
KW didn't show emotion, like love. KW didn't show love to Josh. That wasn't him.
Judy says she never called police, and there were never any charges against KW. As she put it, her own dad beat her ass when she was young, and no one called police back then. When detectives came knocking on her door last year as part of this new investigation into Josh's death, she recounted her memories, and something more.
But they asked me if I felt that KW was capable of, did I think KW murdered Josh? And my answer was, and this would have to be under any circumstances, KW is macho, and he's very arrogant. He's cold. He is cold. I said, because this has all been brought back up, okay, and I've heard so much, I don't want what this person said or this person said to reflect how I feel. And I said, but honestly, do I think he's capable of doing it? Yes. Do I think he did it? I can't answer that. I would hope not.
The marriage ended, Judy said, when it turned violent and she moved out of the house on Columbet Avenue. Bobby, KW's second wife, moved in after that. Just to be clear, Josh is 6 years old, and by now he's calling 3 women mommy, so stay with me here. Josh had his mother, Kathy, his first stepmother, Judy, who had divorced KW by the time Josh got to grade school, and his second stepmother, Bobby, who was a California Highway Patrol officer. So it's spring 1985. Josh is in the first grade. Kathy, his biological mom, gets this call from Rucker Elementary School in Gilroy, telling her to come down. A Child Protective Services worker was there and told her that Josh was afraid to go home. He said his dad had kicked him down the back steps into the garbage cans, and he had bruises down his side. When Kathy arrived, the front office, she says, was packed with sheriff's deputies.
And I'm thinking, my God, happened to Josh? Well, how bad is this? Just so many office deputies there, and I thought they were there for Josh. It didn't turn out that way.
Kathy was in the school nurse's room with Josh when one of the deputies came in and pulled him out. When Kathy got up to go with her son, she says the deputy stopped her. So she watched from the window as the social worker confronted the group of deputies.
She's out there and she's furious. She's like yelling at them. And she's saying, this line of questioning needs to stop. This is, things like, this is illegally, the questioning of a small child like this. And I get up, and the deputy's still standing there, keeping me in that room. And I'm hearing her, and I look out this window, and they took Josh outside the office, and there's like a breeze, the sidewalk area outside the office. He's standing there, and he's surrounded by deputies. And they're talking to him about how he got the bruises. K-Dub's standing there.
The social worker phoned the deputy's supervisor and insisted Josh go home with his mother, and he did. But Kathy said that changed the next day. When she arrived to pick up Josh after school, she said one of KW's fellow deputies had taken it upon himself to give Josh back to KW.
I got there a little early. The buses weren't even in the bus lane yet, and there was KW and a sheriff's deputy in uniform standing at the curb. And they had already pulled Josh out from class, and he was standing up by the school office. And he had his little backpack on, and I walk up to KW and his deputy, and he said that he went home last night, and he thought that the decisions that Child Protective Services made weren't necessary. He goes, I'm making the decision that Josh go home with his dad so he can see that he's going to be okay there and everything's fine. And this deputy left. And Josh walking off, and he's crying. He was crying for me. And he said, Mom.
KW insisted he never abused Josh, period. That first incident, though, was logged in a police report and set off a 4-year tug-of-war over the boy. The claims and counterclaims were laid out in excruciating detail in the family court custody file. They're tough to read and sadly sound so typical of many custody fights. The accusations didn't just fall on KW. At one point, he reported Kathy when Josh came home from a visit to his mother's house. He had bruises and a puffy eye. Kathy said Josh fell off his bike while he was riding over a homemade ramp, but police logged the call nonetheless. So it's 1986, Josh is 7, and the custody case is about to take a big turn. KW and Kathy land before Judge James Stewart in Santa Clara County Family Court. They go ahead with a full-fledged trial, where several people take the stand, including the social worker, KW's first wife, Judy, and one of her grown sons, who was also a sheriff's deputy. When it's over, Judge Stewart, in his findings of fact about the case, lists 8 separate acts of abuse by KW against Josh. Here's just a sampling from the report. He whipped Josh with a belt, sometimes leaving welts. He struck him across the face and body, leaving bruises and marks. With his boots on, KW kicked Josh, and as Judy had told me, KW knocked Josh from the dinner table. By this time, Josh was a seriously disturbed child, Judge Stewart wrote, and is terrified of being hurt or physically punished by his father. KW was a man, Stewart wrote, who has difficulty controlling his anger and has a marked propensity to use physical force when frustrated. I asked KW's lawyer from back then, David Sussman, about Judge Stewart's ruling.
When Judge Stewart, in his court papers, listed all these things that he said there are eight acts of abuse: whipping, kicking, striking across the face. Why wasn't he ever charged with child abuse? It was very strong language in there.
Well, first of all, I think that Stewart overreacted. Okay, I could be wrong on that. Okay, but I think KW was trying to discipline a difficult child in a style that nobody would have made a big fuss about 20, 30 years earlier. That doesn't justify 20, 30 years earlier, and it certainly doesn't justify it during the time that it happened. I'm just giving you a context of where I thought KW was coming from. I think he was a tough guy. His kid was going to be a tough kid, okay? I mean, he was, even early on, going butchering with him, okay? This was a farm kid in a great deal. His father was a sheriff, and his father's girlfriend was a sheriff. If I recall correctly, charges of of child abuse were not what the police were really interested in those days. Okay? It was a personal thing.
It's important to clarify here, this wasn't a criminal trial. Judge Stewart was a family court judge. What he did was take away custody from KW and require him to take parenting classes before he could see Joshua unsupervised again. KW would later write in a family court filing that it helped him understand the needs of his son. When it came to Kathy, the judge called her a nurturing mother, motivated by a genuine concern for the safety of her son. So Josh moved in with his mother and her husband Dennis. The judge expected their house to be a safe haven, a calming place for him. But Josh's behavior spiraled. He was 9 and kicking holes in the walls. He hit a neighbor with a bat and wielded a knife at his mother. At times, Josh's tantrums were so violent, they had to physically restrain him.
We'd have to hold him down on the floor, and he'd be kicking and screaming. And the neighbors coming over asking, can you close the window? You know, told him what was going on. And they didn't want us to think that we were doing this, you know, that we were doing something to make Josh scream out like that. And they last for hours.
Kathy blamed KW for Josh's emotional problems. KW blamed Kathy for failing to control him. And when he found out she had institutionalized Josh in the mental health ward of a local hospital, he filed an emergency petition for full custody. So here they were again, in December 1987, when Josh was 9, back in family court before a new judge for an emergency hearing. 3 child psychologists testified, including one who said Josh wanted to be with his father, and another who said Josh should live with his mother. Judge Jeremy Fogel gave partial custody back to KW and implored the parents to work out their issues in order to help the child. In his ruling, Fogel found that Josh was close to psychotic. The main cause, he wrote, is the conflict between the parents. There was no mention of Judge Stewart's ruling, no mention of KW's abuse. I couldn't understand why. It was a mystery that would take me months to resolve. But the ruling put Josh back in his father's care. Josh spent weekdays with his father and weekends with his mother. For about 9 months, he seemed to be doing better. And then something happened that shook up everyone. 3 months before Josh's death, when he was still 9, the school called to say Josh had written something shocking in his journal.
And then he wrote the note in his school diary, and he said that he wanted to die and that he was going to
Could that note be the explanation for everything that would happen in the barn? It was enough for Bobby, KW's second wife, to call a suicide hotline and get Josh into more counseling, and for Kathy to hide all the neckties in her house.
When I learned about the note, KW called me, and I called Josh's therapist, and he told me that that he had already talked with the Clavers at length, and that he felt that Josh was not suicidal, and that he was just writing, he's just saying that because trying to play the parents against each other, almost like he described it as like Josh was trying to make us fight.
But all that seemed behind them the weekend before Josh died. In January 1989, another ugly dispute erupted that would set the stage for tragedy. Kathy had refused to return Josh to his dad's house after a weekend visit.
We went out to the Pinnacles on a hike, and that was the best weekend we'd had with Josh probably in 3 or 4 years.
That's Dennis Atkins, Kathy's husband. He had been with her for years and helped raise Josh along with their 2 younger daughters.
And he was happy and joyful and bouncing around, and came back that Sunday, and that's when he told us that he didn't want to go back out to his dad's anymore. That he had, and he said it with not as a child. It wasn't a child conversation, or didn't come from a place that a child did. It was just a truth to him that he spoke.
he wasn't having one of his meltdowns. He just said, I'm not going back. I want to live here with you and Dennis. And he says, I'm not going back there anymore. And he was strong about it. He was not doing that anymore. And so I called KW and I told him.
That didn't set well with KW. He showed up at Kathy's house with Hollister police. Kathy and Dennis wouldn't give Josh up. So finally they all agreed to meet in court the next morning. Once there, Kathy and Dennis waited in the hallway until their lawyer, Connie Jimenez, came out with the court's decision. KW would be allowed to pick up Josh and take him home that Monday evening, she said. If Kathy didn't agree, she would be held in contempt. Kathy and her husband Dennis have a very strong memory of what happened next, and I'm going to let them describe it. But you'll hear in later episodes a different version of events, so keep that in mind.
And they wanted me to tell him that it was okay for him to go to his dad's, that he would be safe. And I told Connie, no. No, I said, I'm not sending him out. She goes, Kathy, you have to. I said, would I get in trouble here? Am I going to get smacked by the courts again?
Connie told her it would only be for one night, that the next morning, Tuesday, they'd all come back to court. And this is significant here. For the first time, Josh would speak to a judge alone about what he wanted. The prospect of Josh choosing one parent over another must have weighed heavily on both houses. In one, the mother who might be chosen or rejected by her son. In the other, the father whose history of abuse might come into question. And the boy whose answer could only cause more pain. That meeting with the judge never came. Again, this is Kathy's version. Her mother was babysitting Josh at her house in Hollister during the court hearing in San Jose. Kathy was supposed to get home and explain to Josh what was happening before KW picked him up. But KW got there first.
How did your mom describe Josh as he left with KW?
It was hysterical.
Really? That's what your mom told you?
Yeah. That they had to drag him. KW drug him out from underneath the dining room table. And they just took him and put him in the car.
Kathy says she called the Klaver house every 10 minutes.
No answer.
Why were you calling the house?
To ask KW, what in the hell are you doing? Why did you come and take Josh? I didn't even have a chance to talk to him. No answer. The phone would just ring and ring and ring and ring and ring.
She was annoyed and anxious and worried about Josh. Later that night, her telephone is the one that rang.
It was KW. And it's, what's going on? Why'd you take Josh? And it was, Kathy, you need to come to the hospital. And I'm yelling at him, what happened? What'd you do? And I can't say anything right now. You need to just come down to Gilroy Hospital. And I said, Josh is dead, isn't he? And he said, yes.
Buck Toll, the neighbor boy, remembers that winter night just after 7, when the sirens came whining down Columbet Avenue. As the squad cars, fire trucks, and ambulance pulled into the driveway, he wandered outside to the gate that separated the two properties. His father stopped him. "Let's go inside," Buck remembers his father saying. "You don't need to be seeing this stuff." Buck looked back anyway. He didn't see the worst of it, but one image remains vivid to this day. He remembers the barn being completely lit up. Next, on Hanging.
It seems like the sheriff department came in there and says, "Oh, you're one of us. Oh, I feel bad for you. Your son died. Okay." Nobody looked into anything. Nobody looked into the abuse prior to that.
You said you called KW after I talked to you. So
I called and said, "Hey, KW, heads up. There's a reporter, an investigative reporter, is looking into the death of your late son." He said, thanks for the heads up, and he didn't seem concerned about it, and that was the end of it.
Do you remember anything about the rope or about, like, if it
I
was
never even
tied?
saw the rope. I never saw it.
Did you know what happened to the rope, or did you ask to see the rope?
No, I didn't. I never saw the rope.
Do you know if it was ever...
I'm sure it probably went with the coroner, maybe.
It never did.
It did.
Police are trained to react to the initial call and the presentation. If it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, must be a duck. Sometimes it's not a duck, it's a fuck.
Hanging is an original podcast series from the Mercury News in San Jose. This podcast was hosted and reported by Julia Prodis Sulek, that's me. It was produced by my editor, Mike Frankel, and our sound engineer, Paul Baca. Videos and photography by Lipo Ching. Additional video production by Tor Haugen and Sarah Dussault. Our website is designed by Pi, and Mike Mayer designed the series for the newspaper. Bert Robinson is our managing editor, and Neil Chase is our executive editor. To make sure you hear every chapter, subscribe to Hanging wherever you get your podcasts. To see photos, videos, and documents, and to read the series and comment on this podcast, go to www.mercurynews.com/hanging. That's Mercury, like the planet, news.com/hanging. Thanks for listening.